Hi there, English majors. I'm Christopher Hanlon, and I'm here with another episode of the Close Reading Cooperative, the podcast and literary analysis for English majors. Now, today I wanted to talk with you about the way a motif emerges over the course of a literary text. Now, talking about a motif or recognizing a motif will tend to call upon many of the skills we've been developing together over the past year here on the podcast. But the thing to notice about motifs is that they establish themselves through repetition of something. Okay, that something could be a metaphor or a word or an idea or an image. But the point is that through this repetition, a motif accrues meaning over the course of a longer text. So in order to get at what we're talking about here, I want us to look at a famous text written by Ralph Waldo Emerson and published in 1842, a text called Self-Reliance. Now, self-reliance is about just what its title promises it will be about. It's about relying upon oneself rather than relying upon institutions or other people or anything else. But saying it that way doesn't really capture the way this essay thinks through its subject matter. In order to do that, we need to track the way Emerson handles some of his motifs. So let's take a look now at the way the essay begins. I read the other day some verses written by an eminent painter, which were original and not conventional. The soul always hears an admonition in such lines, let the subject be what it may. The sentiment they instill is of more value than any thought they may contain. To believe your own thought, to believe that what is true for you in your private heart is true for all men, that is genius. Speak your latent conviction, and it shall become the universal sense. For the inmost in due time becomes the outmost, and our first thought is rendered back to us by the trumpets of the last judgment. Okay, now there's a lot here to observe. Let's take a look first at the verbs that Emerson is using in this passage. Okay, the first sentence is about reading. I read the other day. But then, with the next sentence, all of a sudden we're onto a different activity, that of hearing. The soul always hears an admonition. Now, since we're such strong, close readers, we'll tend to notice that in the first sentence, the verb is used in a literal way, right? Emerson is telling us that he was literally reading some verses just the other day. But in the second sentence, that verb hearing means something more figurative, doesn't it? Because we don't literally, hear voices when we read. That's just something Emerson says in order to characterize the act of reading in a particular way. And we can even go further than this. The kind of reading Emerson means to describe is the sort that is original and not conventional. When we read the work of someone who is unafraid to be original, we hear an admonition spoken or intoned by those voices he mentioned. So why is that? Well, if we feel admonished when we read something original, well, maybe that's because we ourselves are not original, not so unafraid. So that's why Emerson then goes on to say that the sentiment they instill is of much more value than any thought they may contain. The most important thing about reading is precisely that the admonition we confront, which Emerson is likened to a voice that says something like, to believe your own thought, to believe that what is true for you in your private heart is true for all men, that is genius. Okay, so now let's move on to the next sentence in that passage. Speak your latent conviction. We could pause here and think about the movement or the curve those verbs represent as we read an Emerson essay. That is, we read and then we hear an admonition, and in our case perhaps it's that Emerson's own admonition, and then if everything works well, we speak. Well, speak what? I suppose it's those original and not conventional thoughts that we tend to keep to ourselves. So the meaning here develops. It's not isolated to a single sentence, and in fact the meaning develops further over the course of the essay. So let's move on to another key passage that appears a few paragraphs later. Not for nothing one face, one character, one fact makes much impression on him, and another none. This sculpture in the memory is not without a pre-established harmony. The eye was placed where one ray should fall, that it might testify of that particular ray. We but half express ourselves, and are ashamed of that divine idea which each of us represents. Okay, so now we have a new metaphor, a new way of getting at the problem of self-reliance. First, we have Emerson insisting that there are truths that make an impression upon very few of us, maybe only one of us. So if we receive something, or if we perceive something, that act of perception is kind of like receiving some kind of impression, according to the metaphor Emerson's using anyway. But if that's the case, well, it's a metaphor that again sort of places us in a passive or maybe a receiving role, as if the truth sort of acts upon us. Then that metaphor, where perceiving something is likened to being pressed upon in some way, shifts. Now we've got a metaphor of vision, Emerson tells us that light falls upon our eye and our eye alone, so that we are the only ones who see it. Now that's still another way of characterizing what happens when we perceive. And then finally, look at the last sentence, where we're right back once again to the metaphor of speech. If we but half express ourselves, well, that's like a kind of a speech impediment, isn't it? A problem of confidence, but also a problem of not speaking properly. Now this pendulum swing back and forth through the essay between, hearing or receiving as a kind of a passive act, and then speaking as the active corollary of those acts continues to develop throughout the essay. So let's take a look at how Emerson handles it in a later passage. These are the voices we hear in solitude, but they grow faint and inaudible as we enter into the world. Society is everywhere in conspiracy against the manhood of every one of its members. Okay, so once again, we're hearing those voices that urge us to be more self-reliant, but as we enter the world, Emerson says, they grow faint. Okay, now that's another way of saying that society everywhere is in conspiracy against the manhood of every one of its members. That as we enter the company of other people, it becomes more difficult to remain self-reliant, to trust ourselves, right, to hear those prior voices Emerson speaks about. Or even rather, we could say, it's to say the same thing, except that calling society a conspiracy is, of course, a new metaphor, which likens conformity to the result of some kind of crime. Now, a little bit later, Emerson elaborates the results of this conspiracy that robs us of our self-reliance, and here he goes. If I know your sect, I anticipate your argument. I hear a preacher announce for his text and topic the expediency of one of the institutions of his church. Do I not know beforehand that not possibly can he say a new and spontaneous word? Okay, so there it is again, this motif whereby self-reliance becomes kind of a way of speaking, a form of speech. The preacher can't say a new and spontaneous word because he doesn't rely upon himself. Rather, he's become the mouthpiece for this institution, in this case, the church. So, this is what we call a motif again, right? This metaphor keeps developing and changing and developing a little bit as we go on through the text. And let's take a look at yet a further passage where Emerson pushes it a bit further. A foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds, adored by little statesmen and philosophers and divines. With consistency, a great soul has simply nothing to do. He may as well concern himself with his shadow on the wall. Speak what you think now in hard words, and tomorrow speak what tomorrow thinks in hard words again, though it contradict everything you said today. Now, everyone always focuses on that first sentence, which tells us that the desire to be consistent is like some little monster, a hobgoblin that kind of bedevils us all the time. And there are some other great metaphors here, like the one about how worrying about consistency is kind of like being content to simply consider your own shadow. But for my money, given the motif we've been tracing, the payoff is down at the sentence where Emerson comes out and tells us how to speak with spontaneity. Speak what you think now in hard words, and tomorrow speak what tomorrow thinks in hard words again, though it contradict everything you said today. Okay, so tracing a motif, in short, is can be messy, and it can take time because complex texts like Emerson's tend to have all kinds of motifs going across purposes with one another sometimes. But doing that, really paying attention to the way a text develops an idea over the whole course, can give you plenty to say in class as an English major, and also plenty to write about later on when you actually have to write an essay about it. So signing off now. This is Christopher Hanlon for the Close Reading Cooperative, and I'll see you next time. Look for those motifs.